So we'll start with preparation. So before you even schedule a meeting, right, we really want to define the purpose and make sure that we have a clear objective to make sure ensure that you're going to have a productive meeting. So really start to think about, what am I trying to accomplish in this meeting? What is the end goal that we're trying to get to? Does it need to be a meeting, right? I'm sure everybody on this call has been to meetings in the past, or you said, probably maybe could have been an email. Everybody's very busy, these days. And so it's really important to make sure that when you are scheduling a meeting that you're really clear on what your objective and your goals are, to make it as successful as possible and impactful for both you and the participants that are attending. So before you schedule that meeting, you want to cover your agenda, right? So make sure you understand the time and location of your meeting. In the age that we're in right now, are you meeting in person? Do you need to make sure you have a specific conference room booked? Are you managing several different schedules? Are you just using a virtual meeting? So all kind of components to keep in mind when you're putting together that agenda. Again, with what we just discussed in your purpose, making sure that you're including your meeting objective in your agenda for your meeting when you're going to send out that invitation that you would send out, and include those list of topics. You're going to have that list of topics, and this is kind of a pre-work item that you want to make sure that you're sending or you're able to send out in your meeting invitation. So what are the specific areas that you need to make sure are covered to ensure that you are meeting that goal or objective that you have, or that outcome that you'd like to accomplish? Time frame for each item. So I'd say this item is optional, but it's just something to keep in mind. If it's a very heavy meeting with a lot of participants, it can be really happy to have a time frame for each specific item. Okay, we're only going to spend 5 minutes here. We're going to spend 10 minutes here. And that's just a way to kind of keep the whole group wrangled and understand expectations from the get-go. Again, especially with those meetings that have a lot of attendees, as it can, those meetings can tend to go in a lot of different directions. So having that really container for your attendees to kind of stick to can help provide that structure. If it's a smaller meeting and maybe you don't have specific timeframes, it can still be helpful just to understand what are the areas that we're going to spend the bulk of our time on, and really setting that expectation, whether in the agenda meeting or at the welcome of your meeting, which we'll get to as well.
Kelly, we have a couple of great questions coming in from Alex. So he mentions, is it best practice to include the agenda in the calendar invite itself or to attach as a file? And then he also mentioned the possibility of whether or not we should be sending an email to kind of prep stakeholders before the actual invite goes out from a calendar invite. So great questions, Alex. Thanks for sharing with everyone.
Those are great questions. Yeah. So the first question, I would say my recommendation is absolutely to include the agenda in the meeting invite itself. That's where it's going to be the easiest for folks to reference back to, and make sure they understand what the meeting is about. Sorry, Molly, you said 3 questions. Can you repeat the second one? I just want to make sure I hit.
No, absolutely. So is it best practice to include the agenda in the calendar invite or as attached as a file? And you said in the calendar invite always. The attached file really comes in if you have participants that have multiple different calendar systems. So if you have Outlook and Google, and or you might have international participants or something along those lines, the attachment can be in addition to, but it must always be in the calendar invite itself. The secondary question, Kelly, was should we send an email and an invite, or is it usually one or the other?
Yep. Okay. That's a great question. And I think that last one is really dependent. So I think in a lot of cases, you can just include the agenda in the meeting invite and any expectations for that meeting. If you need to expand on that, or maybe you have participants in the meeting that you're really expecting to bring something to the table, maybe they're responsible for providing a presentation, maybe they're responsible for reviewing a new process, things like that, I would recommend doing a separate email, and it's almost like a prep plan with those participants. And depending on the depth of that, you can choose to either do that over email, or even sometimes I'll do a quick pre-planning meeting. It depends on how complex that is. Again, in the light of respecting people's time and calendar, sometimes you can even just tack on a 15 minutes or 5 minutes right before the meeting, making sure all the stakeholders that are have one of those active kind of lead roles is prepared. So that would be my recommendation there.
And just to tack on to what Kelly is saying, I literally had that example with a client today. So we are going to be reviewing a process flow diagram. So in addition to including that in my agenda as a prerequisite and attaching the document itself and or the link to the document repository in the invite, I also am having a follow-up with that person because it's a new stakeholder that I haven't met one-on-one with, to make sure that they have access to everything that they need ahead of the meeting. So having that prerequisite terminology associated with this is what we need in order to make this meeting effective. So great questions, Alex. Thank you so much. All right, Kelly.
Great. Perfect. And then the last point I didn't make on this slide is just something that can also be helpful is next to each agenda item, including the type of action that's needed. Is it a discussion? Are we making a decision? Is there going to be follow-up action? Is there going to be a presentation? So you can always just in that list of topics include a little bit more information about what the participants and attendees can potentially expect. So selecting the right participants, this is a really, really important one, right? So we want to make sure that we have the right people in the meeting to be able to get to our expected outcome, right? When we think about that purpose, who are the people that we need to be able to meet that purpose and that agenda? So decision makers, 100%, we need to make sure that we have the right decision makers on the call so that we don't get stalled or blocked on being able to move forward on something. In addition to that, we want to make sure that we have folks, we like to call them SMEs, so subject matter experts for required insight. So think of a team member that maybe has a perspective or insight or expertise in an area that only they can really represent to make sure that they can bring that information to the table to feed into, again, whatever that objective or outcome is, and also making sure that you're providing all of the appropriate information if there is a decision to be made to those decision makers. If you're ever unsure, you know, there's people that you think would be helpful, but they're not required. Don't forget about the option to include them as optional attendees. So in the light of respecting people's schedules, you can always throw people on as optional, especially if their awareness, maybe they don't have a required insight or they're not a decision maker. But if it's just they need to be aware or it's helpful for them to be aware, you can throw them on as optional, and that way they can join if they'd like. And really our big gotcha here, right, is the more people who attend a meeting, the bigger drop in productivity. So when I go back to that kind of time boxing discussion that I mentioned when you're prepping the agenda, as I mentioned, when you have more people, right, there's more voices, so it can just cause meetings to go in different directions at times, which can be great in some examples and being able to bring in those perspectives. But it can cause a drop in productivity and just cause longer discussion. So that's really where you want to try to have the most structure is when you have a larger audience in your meetings.